When I uploaded my Amazoness video, I promised myself that I would never again try so hard to force something so frustrating. Try to make something work out of next to nothing and drive myself mad in the process. And yet, almost 2 years later, here I am. Staring at a silly little moth that's begging for me to just break it already. Hi, I'm Dimax, and this is Moth. It's a 3-cost wind and fire celestial that gets really big and can negate and destroy any rune effect by paying 2 fire spirits. It happens to have the most beautiful art in the entire game as of writing this, has a big splashy effect, and most importantly is my friend, so it's occupied a little spot in my brain for almost the entire time I've been playing Celestials. There are a couple ways to get to the Moth. The most obvious one is to use the Ascension line of Nimbug and Sharkoon, although the condition on Sharkoon to special ascend makes it really tough to justify. You can also play Siracoon instead of Sharkoon and just hard ascend the Moth over the Cocoon, but I think that's a good bit too slow to really happen outside of gold fishing. Unless something huge changes, Nimbug will likely never be played successfully in any serious capacity, especially while Edward is in the metagame. Another potential angle is to channel your inner Wirtz TCG and play Rise from the Ashes. Cards like Comagma and Golden Apples of Discord get the Moth into the bin for Rise to bring back. Pretty simple, and pretty alluring given that Comagma is already in color. My main issue with that is that it costs 5 million spirits and forces you to play a bunch of cards that are independently not good to make anything happen. I'll pretend my method of choice is much cheaper, but Comagma Rise Moth costs 7 spirits, and that's just too much for a 3-card combo. As it currently stands, the best way to go about it is Tower of the Winds. Tower is a card that allows you to Nexus to a Wind Enchanted Celestial, and special sends said Celestial into anything in your hand. I know I was just giving Rise From builds shit for needing a 3-card combo, but the key differences here are accessibility and individual card quality. Think about it, right? You have 6 discard outlets in Apple and Comagma, 3 Moths, and 3 Rise Froms total. You have to find all of those in a reasonable time frame before you get chipped to death by an active opponent, since you need to retain enough Fire Spirits to resolve Moth twice, the maximum you'll need to win a game with a stuck Moth, which is really tough. That's 7 for the combo and 2 to 4 extra, so you don't have to throw an unprotected stick on board for removal to handle. Compare this to Tower of Winds combos, where you need Tower of Winds, any Nexus Bank, Moth, and an Celestial. On paper, this looks worse as a 4-card combo compared to a 3-card combo, but the Nexus Bank and Celestial are 1 card bundled together through Aeolus. You can play up to 9 copies of Aeolus through the big man himself, Elichick, and Findust. Speaking of, Findust also represents up to 9 additional copies of Tower of Winds, as Findust can be searched through Aeolus and any card that searches it, and the only piece here that you actually have to find the hard way is exactly Moth. And with consistency tools like Astrabbit and combo all-star Drops of Leaf, that isn't necessarily hard. Card quality in tower builds is also significantly higher because of the Celestial lineup and the many little synergies among them. You can totally play a weird wind toolbox plan in the earlier stages of the game while you try to assemble the 4 special cards using the guys like Toxiswarm, Sorlet, and Galaxair. Toxiswarm in particular is worth a little more than the others because its good effect triggers every time it receives a Wind Spirit, which synergizes a lot with Tower of the Winds. Even though the Celestial ascends immediately into something else, that Nexus does still trigger on receive effects. The way that it works is that you Nexus to the guy, its effect enters Limbo, you ascend, and then in a new chain, the effect leaves Limbo and enters the chain. This means receivers are extremely high value ascension targets in this deck. Toxiswarm deals a solid 2 to the opponent before turning into a Moth, Nemisail heals a massive 4, completely refunding your plays plus a little extra, and Pegus can pop 2 runes before the Moth sticks. Pegus sounds really extra given that the Moth has built-in negation, but the only real out to Moth now that removal is limited is to have 2 counter runes that can remove it, and Pegus being able to get the sets to a place where a Moth is uncontested or can negate freely puts the opponent on better have 2 kill spells, which is really rare unless they have Boombat or are yellow and green. Speaking of Boombat, Aramare is another unique tool this deck gets access to. You've probably already seen the horse in Rhino Sect, but this deck uses it far better than Rhino ever really could. Rhinosect only wants Aramare as a way to cast Sex, but if you ascend Moth over Aramare, the game functionally ends. Boombat being the premier kill spell doesn't feel so great when it doesn't work against a bug that negates everything else. Also, Aramare has 9 total attack and defense stats on a 1-drop. That's like a whole ass live. That's a good card. I kind of glossed over it earlier, but Findust is another all-star here because of how flexible a search it is. It does feel worse than Elwichik in a lot of situations because you see a lot of tempo, and a double Findust opens are capital R rough, but the consistency is worth it. When sticking Moth is game over, I'll take as much of that as I can get. It also gives you a pretty cute edge into Morlith piles, because Findust sacking itself off means your opponent needs to commit more to the grave than just like and subscribe to get their snowmen ready, which gives you the breathing room to cast a Moth they can't out before they have the chance to put pressure on you. Findust also plays crazy well with Aramare, because you can ascend Findust over Aramare to get a double wind enchanted Findust, trigger Aramare to cast itself, and then Findust search for Tower of Winds, and now you have both a Nexus Bank and a Receiver on field ready to combo with. All you're missing is Moth. Unfortunately, that's kind of the trend with this deck. Everything is super easy to assemble except the big silly Moth. Just one of the many annoyances you'll encounter playing Big Moth. I guess now's as good a time as any, so let's just get into all the most frustrating parts of Big Moth Man. As I just mentioned, you can't search it. Incredibly easy to set up and turbo out, but you only find a 3 of so often in a 40 card deck. In deck building, you kind of have to make a choice. Play a ton of cards like Nectar and Drops at max copies to increase your deck velocity and risk paying too low to play with your Moth in a meaningful way, or just accept that sometimes you'll play Bunk Wind. The sweet spot, I think, is to just play Drops and trust in the deck, but you have to understand the risks associated with that. Like I mentioned, Moth also requires a metric ton of spirits dedicated just to itself. Unless you play Sharkoon, your deck will be extremely heavy on wind and have next to no other fire cards since they don't really help you make progress and you can't towers to them. But because every Moth activation costs 2 fire, you need the 1 to cast it in addition to at least 4 more to activate it twice. And now you have 15 slots to divide between Wind, Thunder for Ash Driver because you do need the consistency, and any other splashes you need like Water for Tsunami or Earth for Earthquake. You end up with either a very uncomfortable spirit deck or an extremely awkward sideboard with way too many spirits and some truly bizarre siding patterns. But why does Flaming Moth need 2 activations? I keep mentioning that number, but I haven't explained the logic yet. Well, it's really simple. Your opponent will have removal. Shield of Achilles and Poison Tipped Arrow are real and can't hurt you. Sure, Shield does still have to pay out the 4 as cost before you try to negate it, but there's always a Gorgon's Gaze lurking alongside it to stuff you. Obviously, dealing 6 to your opponent is good, but it's not as good as winning the game by staking a Moth. Using P-Gust for Ascension combos can mitigate this a smidge, but you'll often be in positions where you need to prioritize the healing of Nemisail or the protection of Aramare. Because of that, you need to be ready to throw negates away to ensure your big critter doesn't burn out. Just sticking the Moth for 1 turn isn't enough to win, though. People are allowed to play multiple runes per turn, and because of how fast you can Moth, your opponent will likely be at a pretty high life total by the time your Moth sticks. The Moth needs to connect multiple times, so you need a second activation to eat any additional runes the opponent will draw into. And, it can be pretty easy to say that your opponent just won't have more runes, but unfortunately they just will. But, just have to cross that bridge when we get there. Cool Moth fact. Flaming Moth only negates rune effects, not runes period. This means Flaming Moth can't negate runes without activated effects like Stadiums, Invokes, or Divines that settle for only 1 spirit. It seems really minor since a lot of those are pretty low value cards, but there are a ton of game states where you really feel that difference. It's not all that bad though. Like I said, the deck has so many redundant pieces that you can consistently assemble combos as early as turn 2 or 3, and man, it just feels great slamming a huge beefy body down and hearing those beautiful words. I don't think I can beat that. It really is a feeling like no other. Plus, sometimes you also just open the God Hand and the game starts with a really huge Moth. Those games are just, oh man, they're the best. Also, because the deck shares so much DNA with standard Wind Nexus, you can totally just side into a low to the ground Wind Nexus deck and hose anyone expecting Moth Wombo combos post board. I don't know how good that is though, because to be honest, I'm just not good at Wind Nexus at all. The deck just doesn't spark joy. I never put in the effort to learn it. It's honestly a real shame that this is the state Moth is in. There are just so many awesome synergies and ruling tricks the deck takes advantage of that don't get to shine very often, like off-field receive triggers from Tower of Winds, or the Findust Aramare combo, but because of how hard it is to find the silly bug that pays all of it out, and how much tempo you have to sacrifice to assemble the pieces, sometimes the deck just isn't where it needs to be. I've been seeing a decent amount of success at the local level playing Big Moth, but unless something crazy gets released that changes everything, I wouldn't recommend bringing this deck to anything with stakes. If nothing else, just because of how frustrating it can be having to mulligan 3 times just to find half of your combo. Alright, see ya.